There's a story of an artist who was proud of his paintings, and he thought he'd go sell them. So he went down to the local art gallery and put up his paintings, and he waited a while, and over a period of time he decided he'd go down and check out what was happening with his paintings. So he went in and he talked to the art director and asked him how things were going with his paintings, and the art director told him, he said, "Well, I got some good news and I got some bad news." "Well, what's the good news?" So the good news is there was a gentleman here yesterday. He wanted to know if the value of your paintings would increase if you were to die. And I, of course, told him absolutely. And so he decided to buy all of your paintings. And the artist said, "Well, that's great." He said, "But what's the bad news?" He goes, "Well, that gentleman was your doctor." And this kind of reminds me of what was happening with Israel at this time. They're about to enter into the land, the promised land. And that's the good news. But the bad news was about to happen as well. And Moses began to tell them what was going to transpire once they entered into the land. In fact, Moses goes on to tell them in Deuteronomy chapter 31, he says, first of all, you're going to become corrupt. I don't know how I would react if someone was going to tell me beforehand that I was going to walk away from God. I just couldn't conceive of that. But in any event, he told them that they would become corrupt. Then, if that wasn't bad enough, he told them that they would forget God's commandments. And if that wasn't bad enough, he told them that they would provoke God's wrath upon them. And finally, he said, you will forsake your God upon entering the land. And of course, that came about with and through idolatry. But when you think about corruption, and you think about provoking God, forgetting God's commandments, forsaking them in idol worship, I can't help but think of Romans chapter 1. And that's exactly what happened to the Gentiles. And that's how they too would go away and went away. And so God promised that He would remove them. And it was as if He tore Israel from the throne of David away from them because of their sins and their rebellion. It also reminds me of Matthew chapter 18 and verse 7, where Jesus says, woe to those where occasions of stumbling come, for they must come, but woe to the man by which they come. And so we're looking at temptation, we're looking at sin, and he says, that's going to happen in your life. But woe to you if you let it happen. If you have the responsibility that God has given you not to fall. But if you do fall, you have the responsibility of picking yourself back up. The man that doesn't pick himself back up, woe to that man. God, as it were, again, tore them from the house of David, the kingdom of Judah. 2 Kings chapter 17. All of which was the result of a people willingly following in the sins of Jeroboam. Now, this is significant because Jeroboam is referred to 21 times as the one who made Israel to sin. 21 times. Several theories concerning the tribes of Israel, the northern kingdom, have arisen over the years. Since there's no explicit information concerning the fate of these tribes, some imagine that they had migrated to Israel, from Israel to England. Others claim that they're remnants of the tribes of Israel that had somehow come over to the Americas, and that they're the descendants of the Native Americans here in this country. Of course, when the Jews had settled in their own land, they began to rebuild the temple, which project took about 6 years. And when it was completed, it was formally dedicated. And at the dedication, sacrifices were offered. And in Ezra chapter 16 and verse 7, the Bible tells us that 100 bulls were offered, as well as 200 rams and 400 lambs. And then he says, I want you to offer 12 goats for the sin offering, which represented the 12 tribes of Israel. So those 12 tribes are still there, even after the completion of the Second Temple. And so, as we continue, he says, it is thus clear that the 10 tribes were never lost. Some of these either remained in Babylon or else returned with their kinsmen to the southern kingdom. As with many other Jews, eventually they were scattered far and wide. When Christ was born and was brought to Jerusalem to fulfill certain requirements of the law, there was a Hebrew woman, a prophetess of the tribe of Asher, one of the supposedly lost tribes, who was praising God in the temple. Her name was Anna, found in Luke chapter 2 and verse 36. As noted previously, Judah was by no means innocent. They too played the harlot, or as the King James would say, had gone a-whoring, violating God's commandments. And although God did spare them from being taken by the Assyrians, when Hezekiah came to power, however, serving as king over Judah for 29 years, he fell deathly ill. The prophet Isaiah told him he would die from his illness. But with a contrite heart, Hezekiah prayed to God, asking forgiveness and to be spared from death. 2 Kings chapter 20. Now this beautiful prayer was recorded by Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 38. And hearing his prayer, God extended his life another 15 years. However, Hezekiah then made an imprudent alliance with Babylon. Fighting against Sargon and the Assyrians, Hezekiah was duped into revealing all of Judah's wealth and strength to Babylon. Displeased, God sent Isaiah to rebuke Hezekiah, telling him that due to his unwise actions, Judah will now go into Babylonian captivity. And of course, Jeremiah chapter 25 and verse 8 tells us the reason why in summary fashion: because they disobeyed God. And over and over again we find here the allusions to the possibility of God's children falling away, the possibility of apostasy. And every time that we turn to these passages that deal with falling away, we're dealing with disobedience. And so I find it very disheartening that even some of our own brethren are at the point where they're denying that one can fall from grace. And yet over and over again, both in both covenants, both the Old Testament and New Testament, we find the fact that salvation is conditional. There's an if-then. If we walk in the light, if we confess our sins, if we continue in the faith, if you abide in my word. These are the passages which clearly show that there is this if-then proposition. Let's talk a little bit about the capture and the deportation of Judah. In 612 BC, Babylon destroyed the city of Nineveh, defeating Assyria. And this set the stage for their invasion of the southern kingdom. In 606 to 605, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Israel, and thus begins the exilic period, or the period of exile. This also marked the beginning process of a three-stage deportation process. Nebuchadnezzar took certain children of Judah, including Daniel, and those seemingly of good stock or royal blood, in order to begin grooming them to become wise men for Babylon. In 603, Jehoiakim, king of Judah at this time, led a rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar and lost. He was captured and taken prisoner to Babylon. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. The vessels of the temple were also removed and taken back to Babylon, being placed in their pagan temple. Judah had become subject to the state of Babylon, having to pay taxes to Nebuchadnezzar. The second stage of deportation began approximately 597 BC. And Jehoiakim was reigning as king of Judah at this time. After besieging Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar captured Jehoiakim, all of Jerusalem, including all the treasures of the temple, and all the king's house, and brought them all back to Babylon. Judah's leaders and laborers and craftsmen, including the prophet Ezekiel, were taken to Babylonian exile. Third and final stage of deportation began approximately 587 to 586 BC. And during the reign of Judah's next king, Zedekiah, whose real name was Mattaniah, the uncle of Jehoiakim. One would think Judah, after going through all this turmoil with Babylon, would have repented and turned back to God, but such was not to be the case. Instead, they continued their rebellion. And this third and final stage of deportation is the most significant because it was at this time that the house of God, the temple, was burned down and destroyed, along with the walls of the city. Jewish people today still commemorate this tragic event, known as the Tisha B'Av. We also learn that the Babylonians put out the eyes of Zedekiah, blinding him. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple occurred in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign as king. And the person responsible for burning the house down was Nebuzaradan, and he was a servant of Nebuchadnezzar. The chief priests were carried away to the city of Rivlah in Syria, approximately 175 miles away, and it is here that Nebuchadnezzar put them to death. 2 Kings chapter 25. Over the people who had still remained in the land, Nebuchadnezzar placed a governor, Gedaliah, son of Achim, son of Shaphan. His providential headquarters was at the city of Mizpah. His providential, additionally, the prophet Jeremiah, who began writing under the reign of Josiah and continued serving under Jehoaz, Jehoiakim, Zedekiah, and under the governorship of Gedaliah. Jeremiah, along with his secretary Baruch, remained in Mizpah after declining an invitation to go to Babylon. And we find that in Jeremiah chapter 40. Gedaliah was eventually assassinated by Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and a member of the Judean royal family, who had been sent by Baalis, king of the Ammonites, in Jeremiah chapter 40. Although occurring in the 7th month, no year is specified. Ishmael also killed 70 of some 80 pilgrims from Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria, who were coming to present grain offerings and incense at the temple. Those who were spared, including several army officers, fled to Egypt, taking Jeremiah with them. This temple may have been at or near Mizpah where they went, or the neighboring town of Bethel. And when Ishmael was later confronted by troops led by Johanan of Gibeon, many of his followers deserted him and fled to the Ammonites. And we read about that in Jeremiah chapter 41. The Bible records various figures for the deportations. For the 597 BC deportation, the Bible records 10,000 and 8,000, but it is not clear whether these numbers are to be taken as alternate amounts or whether there should be totaled up together. In Jeremiah, we find the following figures: 3,023 Judeans, 822 Jerusalemites, 745 Judeans, which would be a total of 4,060. However, most conservative estimates put the total number of Jews taken into captivity at a much higher number, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50,000. They represented the leading people from that vantage point. And whatever the number of the Bible, however, indicates, we surely know that Judah had gone into captivity and were carried away out of his land. Now let's talk about the condition of the Jews in Judah while in exile in Babylon. At the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, there were a number of Jews who were not taken to Babylon, being left behind. The author of 2 Chronicles suggests that that land lay empty during the exile, enjoying its Sabbaths, and further corroborated by other passages such as Jeremiah 13, 2 Kings 25, and 2 Kings 17. It does not mean there was no one there, but that there were far fewer inhabitants in the land. 2 Kings indicates that only the poorest people of the land were left after the first deportation. So it seems that King Nebuchadnezzar desired that the produce of the land, such as the olives and the grapes, having vine dressers and tillers, to remain behind for the purpose of working the land. Refugees from Moab, Ammon, and Edom returned after they heard about Gedaliah being appointed as governor. As stated in the preceding chapter, a group of Jews was left in and around Jerusalem after its destruction by Nebuchadnezzar. We have seen also that these were mostly undesirable and irresponsible people who would not be of any profit to Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Kind of reminds me of the Cuban refugee crisis back in 79 and 80, when Castro had sent out all the dregs of society and let them come to America. He didn't want anything to do with them. The Jews who fled to Egypt prospered, although it seems some of them renounced Jehovah God and began serving the pagan gods of Egypt. Most of these Jews remained there even after the exile period came to an end, and the exiled Jews had returned to Jerusalem. Many of these Jews lived in Alexandria, which is where the great Septuagint was produced in 285 BC. Of course, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, often quoted by Jesus and his apostles. The Jews exiled in Babylon also enjoyed some relative freedom of their own. They were colonists with freedom to do practically as they chose to do, provided, of course, that they remained loyal to the Babylonian government. Generally speaking, they were allowed to govern themselves and manage their own affairs. In religious matters also, they appear to have had reasonable freedom. Their leading men were expected to conform to the religious practices of the kingdom, as in the case of Daniel and his companions. But there is no record of the whole group being persecuted on a religious grounds. And although they enjoyed some measure of freedom and prosperity, the exiles nonetheless suffered from their displacement, as we read about in Psalm 137, verses 1 through 9. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they carried us away captive, required of us song, and that they wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above the chief joy. Remember, O Lord, the children of Edom, in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, even to the foundation thereof. O daughter of Babylon, who art to be destroyed, happy shall he be that rewardeth thee as thou hast served us. Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones. These exiles settled in the vicinity of Nippur on the river Khabur. While on exile, the elders played a major role in the exilic community. The custom of praying toward Jerusalem seems to have begun at this time, and issues like circumcision, Sabbath keeping, and many other dietary laws became marks of Jewish identity during this time. Let's talk a little bit about the summary of the exilic prophets and their writings. There are three primary prophets associated with this period: Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. We'll briefly summarize their writings, capturing the thrust of each of their passages. And although much of Jeremiah's ministry preceded the period of captivity, he does write to the exiles in Babylon, offering them both hope and strength. And he taught them to continue in courage and in the faith of God. Jeremiah served in Judah, prophesying prior to the exile, during the time of deportations, and at the time of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. After witnessing the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations, where he laments over the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the captivity of its people. He denounced Israel's leaders as professional prophets, in particular with whom he has many encounters. These professionals were liars because they prophesied peace And from the prophet even unto the priest, every one dealeth falsely. They have healed also the hurt of the daughter of my people, saying, Peace, peace, when there is no peace. His message of doom and gloom caused him to be hated. He was both flogged and imprisoned for his preaching. And because of their rebellion and the abuse he took, he became troubled, often living in hiding. And for this reason, he's called the weeping prophet. We get some insight into his emotional state in chapters 8 through 20. In this section, we come across what has been called the Confessions of Jeremiah. For instance, he writes, Oh, that my head were waters, and mine eyes of fountains of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people. It is within this section that we also find Jeremiah cursing the day he was born and accusing God for deceiving him, of enticing him to act as his messenger, only to be met with humiliation and shame. And it's here we learn that God's words were raging inside of him, knowing that he must preach them. It's here we find God, through Jeremiah, pleading for his people to return. Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways and ask. Ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls. But they said, we will not walk therein. And so no wonder Jeremiah wept. However, Jeremiah would balance his hard but needed message with some needed consolation. And these passages are found particularly in chapters 30 to 33, where he envisages the restoration. The exile will come to an end, and they would have a new Davidic king to rule over them, having a new covenant as well. We read about that in Jeremiah chapter 31. Let's talk about Daniel. The prophet Daniel was taken captive to Babylon during the first deportation in 606, where he would prophesy from the palace of Babylon. Daniel spent his entire prophetic career in captivity, estranged from the land of Judah. He refused to bow down to any other god. He observed the dietary laws and often prays facing Jerusalem. He seems to occupy a position of honor in the court with Nebuchadnezzar. As a prophet of God, one who both forthtells and foretells, Daniel had the power to interpret dreams predicting the future. It was at this point in time that he was severely tested, but remained faithful to God. In chapter 2 of the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a huge statue, having a head of gold, a torso of arms and silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and the feet mixed of iron and clay. He then has another dream where animals represent the aforementioned metals. Daniel then decodes the dream. Each metal represents the kingdom that ruled the ancient Near East. Daniel explicitly mentions that the gold represented Babylon. Read about that in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 38. While silver represented the Medo-Persian Empire, which would eventually conquer Babylon in 539. The bronze represented Alexander's Greece, and the iron, the Roman Empire, which eventually divided into Western and Eastern empires, both iron and clay. The stone that grew into a mountain represented the kingdom of God, which would be established during the days and the rule of the kingdom of iron, the Roman Empire. Daniel chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. Daniel writes, in the days of these kings shall God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall nor the kingdom be left to another people. But it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and the kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush them and put an end to all these kingdoms. Daniel began his interpretation of the dream by telling Nebuchadnezzar that God revealed what would take place in the latter days. Daniel, of course, was referring to the Church of Christ, which is the kingdom that was set up or established while Rome was in power during the first century. And finally, the prophet Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel was taken captive during the second deportation in 597. He was exiled in Babylon during the final destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem in 587. The prophecies in the book of Ezekiel follow a fairly chronological order. The first 24 chapters are the prophecies delivered in Babylon before the destruction of Jerusalem in 587. Now, within this section, there is a depiction of the kavod, the glory of God departing Jerusalem. This kavod was like a cloud containing God's presence or glory. This is also the term used in Exodus 24, where we read about the kavod settling on Mount Sinai, which represented God's presence and or glory. In Exodus 40, this same cloud covers the tent of meeting, filling the tabernacle. Ezekiel described it as the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face, and I heard a voice of one that spake. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 28. In other words, it was a semblance or a likeness of the glory or the presence of the Lord. The kavod contained the figure or the representation of God's glory or presence. This is similar to how Solomon described the imminence of God's presence or glory on earth in the temple. After building a temple, Solomon asked a rhetorical question, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I have builded?" 1 Kings 8:27. Here the word indeed is simply used to mean literally or truly. Concerning the metaphysical nature of deity, Solomon was asking if God would literally dwell on the earth and in the temple. The implied answer was a resounding no, for God does not so eminently dwell. Therefore, like the dwelling of God on the earth and in Solomon's temple, God's eminence in the kavod was said to be figurative. Perhaps this serves in showing how a transcendent God participates in our world today. Isaiah writes, "For as the rain cometh down and the snow from heaven, and returneth not thither, but watereth the earth, and maketh it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower, and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goeth out from my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing where I sent it." Isaiah 55:10 and 11. Here, Isaiah is intimating that the Word of God is the means by which God acts or participates in the world. After all, it is the word of His power that upholds all things, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 3. Moreover, to say something is accomplished by His Word is synonymous with saying that God performed the action. God speaking and God acting are indeed the same thing. And so declared the psalmist, "The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaketh the cedars. Yea, the Lord breaketh the cedars of Lebanon. He maketh them also to skip like an elf, like a calf. Lebanon and sirloin, I had sirloin on the mind, like a young unicorn. The voice of the Lord divideth the flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shaketh the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord maketh the hinds to calve, and discovereth the forest, and His temple doth everyone speak of His glory." So here we find this parallelism, so often found in Jewish writings, equates the action of His voice with the action of God. It's the same reality. God and His voice or word share the same ability. To say God performs an action is to say His word performs the same action, and vice versa. A concept which teaches that God's immanence, active presence, is accomplished through His word. Later, while in a vision, Ezekiel was transported to the temple in Jerusalem to witness the atrocities and the abominations, which explain why the temple and city were destroyed in the first place. While viewing the slaughter and the destruction, Ezekiel sees the kavod rise from the temple and moved to the east. He then sees it ascending from the midst of Jerusalem to the hill east of the city. Then, in another vision, the Spirit takes him to Chaldea, Babylon, to those who were in captivity. This image demonstrates a vital principle worthy of consideration. God will abandon those who continue in sin and rebellion, but He will maintain a spiritual relationship with those who continue to trust and obey Him. God fellowships righteousness and forsakes unrighteousness. In this case, God left the unrighteous behind in Jerusalem to be with the righteous in Babylon. Ezekiel and the captives now understand that God doesn't have a relationship with a particular place, but with a particular people, those who practice righteousness. Ezekiel makes it clear to all generations that those who ignore God, His Word, and the warnings therein will be eternally doomed. However, those heeding God's Word will be spared, enjoying life eternal with their Creator. We learn that individual responsibility was necessary then, and it is equally necessary today. God's children would do well to remember this point preached by Ezekiel. As for his father, because he cruelly oppressed, spoiled his brother by violence, and did that which was not good among his people, lo, even he shall die in his iniquity. Yet say ye, why? Doth not the Son bear the iniquity of the Father? When the Son hath done that which is lawful and right, and hath kept all my statutes, and hath done them, he shall surely live. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father, neither shall the Father bear the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. But if the wicked will return from all his sins that he hath committed, and kept all my statutes, and do that which is lawful in his sight, he shall surely live. He shall not die. All his transgressions that he hath committed, they shall not be mentioned unto him. In his righteousness he hath done, he shall live. And we can continue reading that, or we could go to the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 8 and in chapters 10, he said, their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. For they shall be to me as my people, and I shall be to them as their God. Thank you for your kind attendance.